Hey, welcome to Christ the Lord Clearwater's weekly message. I'm Pastor John Beck, is here in my office in Clearwater, Florida, where our church shares the good news of Jesus on the Gulf Coast. I'm going to preface today's video by just acknowledging that sometimes life gets a little busier than other times, and while I usually record our weekend messages in our studio area, essentially, on a stage with different equipment and customized lighting, and do a lot of work and editing and post-production. Because my resources today are a little slimmer than usual, I'm going to give you a one take, looking over my shoulder at my teaching graphics message. It'll maybe feel a little bit more personal. I won't be able to polish everything or cut out the things that I normally would in a more lengthy hands-on edit, but I hope you'll still appreciate today's message as we talk about feeling grateful, discovering the joy of finding good in our lives. If you've been with us for a while, you might know that this is week 4 of a 4-week series on gratefulness. And in week 1 we talked about what gratefulness is, and in week 2 we talked about discovering physical reasons for gratitude in the earthly world. We called them echoes of Eden, that even though life is difficult and much is broken, there's still enough evidence of the goodness of God that He brings into the world that we can all have some reason for gratitude. And then last week, week 3, I talked more about the spiritual nature, the ethereal, the abstract blessings that we have, and how to discover those in the world. So you note then that everything up to this point has been what are the sources of blessing that we discover that cause us to feel grateful, and how do we notice them around us? They're there, but how do we notice them? Today, as we conclude this series, I'm going to talk about the idea that a feeling of gratefulness can be generated, and that's why we've got the title here, Generating Gratefulness. To get us into this, I'll take you into a little bit of my personal life. In the evenings, oftentimes before bed, I'll be reading news or internet forums, Reddit, on topics I like, tech, and that's the last thing I'll do before bed. So I'll have my phone out, but of course a phone generates very bright light, and I happen to share a bedroom with my wife. So the light that I generate, it's not meant to be shared. And in order to be considerate of her, oftentimes to read my bright phone screen in bed in the dark, I'll do this. Whoop! I'll pull the blankets over my head. And that's what phone light does when you're reading it at night. There's another kind of light that, for example, we had in our outdoor service tonight, a campfire. We had a flickering fire that we all kind of gathered around, and this type of light isn't meant to be hidden. In fact, the light of a campfire is a light that usually intentionally surround with people, and this light is distributed between all of them rather than limited or put under the covers. Now today, as we talk about gratefulness in the Christian church, we're going to ask what may be an obvious answer, but which one of these experiences do we hope the Christian's experiences? Which is Christian gratefulness? Is it what we talked about the last few weeks, looking at the world and finding things that can make me grateful? So kind of my own personal story under the covers, looking at light myself. Or is gratitude something that is more like a brightness of blessing that is to be distributed out from us or to many other people? And we'll conclude this series by answering, you might have guessed it, that this is what we hope Christians can get to with God's help, that we become a generative source of gratefulness. Now, I like this idea because it's so empowering. It means regardless of your wealth, your education, how smart or not smart, how skilled or not skilled you are, every Christian has the opportunity to make a impact for good in this world. So if you ever feel like you haven't accomplished anything, you're not worth anything, in today's message we'll see that you have real power to impact reality and people's earthly existence in a meaningful way. To get started, we're going to take a trip to the Mediterranean. This may look like it, Rorschach ink blot test, but this is a black and white map of the Mediterranean area across the world. You might notice that boot there, that's Italy. And if you go down to the bottom corner, this is Egypt, where the pyramids are. Much of the Bible history in Genesis took place there. If you go up the coast, that little area is where Jesus was born in Bethlehem. And if we kind of go back up to the tip of the water by where the boot top is, that's where we started in week 1, 4 weeks ago, in Thessalonica, where the Apostle Paul wrote them a letter, hoping that they could find joy, discover joy, and rejoicing and giving thanks in all circumstances. Well, that wasn't the only letter that Paul wrote that was related to having a grateful spirit. He also wrote a letter to a church family that was down here in Corinth. And in that letter, Paul is speaking about something he hoped the readers wouldn't miss. So he essentially asked the question, "Hey, Corinth, have you heard the news?" There's something big he wanted them to pay attention to. And the news was something going on to the north of Corinth in an area, a region that we call Macedonia. There were a bunch of Christian churches there. Well, what was going on in Macedonia that Paul wanted the Corinthians to know about and is related to our theme of generating gratefulness? Let's dig in. It turns out that the Macedonian Christians discovered gratefulness. Like, their lives changed significantly, and they started to generate gratefulness for other people, made an impact on the world by bringing more good into it. They were generating gratefulness, which is the key theme for this talk. That region of the world had done several things. There was collections for the poor, and Paul had been involved in essentially a huge regional food pantry drive that would help Christians in Jerusalem who were experiencing famine. But they had also taken up collections of money to help the missionaries who were sharing good news around the region. That's what the Macedonians were doing. They were generating good, they were giving it away, and that led other people to feel grateful. So when Paul wrote them, he said, "Hey, Corinth, have you heard that yet? That's what was going on in Macedonia?" Well, it turns out that they did know. So here's the Bible quote. Paul said, "There's no need for me to write to you about this service to the Lord's people, for I know your eagerness to help, and I've been boasting about your eagerness to help others to the Macedonians, telling them that since last year you, Christians in Corinth, were ready to give, and your enthusiasm has stirred most of them to action. But I'm sending the brothers in order that our boasting about you in this matter should not prove hollow, but that you may be ready, as I said you would be. For if any Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, we, not to say anything about you, would be ashamed of having been so confident. So I thought it necessary to urge the brothers to visit you in advance and finish the arrangements for the generous gift you had promised. Then it will be ready as a generous gift, not as one grudgingly given." Yeah, that was a lot of Bible text I just threw at you, but here's a summary of the flow of thought. Paul was writing the Corinthians, and he said, "Hey, Corinth, have you heard the news?" And the news was, have you heard that the Macedonians up north were very generous, and they were acting in generous ways, which was causing people to feel grateful? Then he said, well, they were inspired by your plans, Corinth. You see, the Corinthians had an idea about how they could be generous, and then they started to talk about it. And when the Corinthians talked about it, the Macedonians picked up on that and said, wow, that's an amazing idea. So the Macedonian churches put it into practice even before the Corinthians acted on their own plan. But you, Corinth, Paul would say down south, you haven't completed the plans that you talked about. And the pickup is on its way, as if you were collecting food for a food pantry drive or offerings for a mission festival. The pickup is on its way, and just imagine if one of those drivers was a Macedonian, right? These guys who are so inspired by you that they started their own generosity actions. So Paul said, I want you to have your gift ready so that you don't stress out when these brothers arrive, these brothers who used you as their inspiration, Corinth, these brothers who were already being generous, and now they are coming down to pick up what you promised. And just imagine if they show up and you, who had promised much and inspired so many, hadn't actually done anything yet. So Paul was writing them to encourage them to take their amazing idea, which turned into inspiring speech, and put it into action. Okay? So Paul wanted Corinth to be this, not just like in their own thought process. Here's what generosity is. He wanted them to make it so real that it began to flow out of them and impact the crowd. Don't stay there, but let's make it materialize in the world. Make generosity happen. Now, it seems that the church in Corinth was all on board with the idea of being generous, and they talked about it, but it seemed that they were slow to actually acting on those noble ideas and words. What if, they might have said, what if we here in Corinth can't practice what we preach? I think that can be a scary thing for Christians, or a little, maybe something that we feel guilty about. Like, we know that generosity is a virtue. We know that God calls us to give a cloak to another if we have two and they have none. And yet, it's so easy to know about generosity, or to say generosity is important, but it's a much different thing to actually act on it. So what if God calls us to this deeply sacrificial, very selfless, thoughtful lifestyle, and we don't think we quite have the resources to do what God calls us to do? So Paul wrote to the congregation in Corinth, and it seems like that was what they were concerned about. So he said, remember this, whoever sows sparingly will reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. He wanted them to think about generosity in terms of the way seeds and kind of farming works. So here's the thought. Imagine if you were hungry and you had just one little bite of corn, a corn kernel to eat. If you would eat that one corn kernel, it would help you a little bit. You might turn it into one piece of popcorn and eat that one piece of popcorn, and then your one kernel is done. Alternatively, if you could not eat that kernel, but if you could plant it, what might it turn into down the road? It might turn into a cob of corn. And if you take a cob of corn with all those kernels and all of those seeds and you start replanting them, you turn up not with a cob of corn, but with a cornfield. And this is what the Apostle Paul is reminding them. He says, that's how, the agricultural world works. If you sow a few seeds, you'll only reap a small harvest. But if you sow a ton of seeds, you'll reap a ton of harvest. But even though that's the case, you still ask the question, what if I make that sacrifice? I don't eat that one popcorn kernel and I plant it instead, but what if my little seed doesn't grow? This is the fear of maybe the Christian who doesn't feel that they are in a position with their finances or wallet or property to really just give tons away. Rich people can afford to be generous, but if you're not super wealthy, you might think, do I really have enough, so much extra that I can just give it away? What if I do that? If I plant this little seed and I make that sacrifice and it doesn't actually grow into anything at all? Well, Paul wrote in this letter, he takes this fear into account in verse 10. He said, he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will also supply and increase your store of seed and will enlarge the harvest of your righteousness. And Paul doesn't say who this guy is who's in charge of making seeds be present and making food grow so that it can turn into bread, the supply of seed. But he expects the Corinthians and us to know that he's talking about our God, creator and provider. And Paul is saying, God, who knows how seed works and makes seeds grow, is the one who is going to be working with you and will enlarge the harvest of your righteousness. While we plant those seeds, it's up to God to be the one to make them grow. So the question is, then how do we know God cares about us and will take care of a harvest if we decide to be generous? How will God make sure that we don't ruin ourselves through generosity? Well, it's because God already proved what's in his heart toward us. What did the good Lord do for us in Christ? God demonstrated his love for us in this way. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. He gave his only Son. And if God did not spare his only Son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also give us, along with Christ, all good things? The story of Jesus is the story of a complete devotion of God to the rescue plan to restore us to himself and make us new again, give us hope and peace and a future. He did the big work, meeting our big needs, and changed our big destiny. If he gave us something really big, like Christ, and the gifts that come through Christ, can't he also give us something little? Like if he can take care of eternity problems, can't he also take care of the little problems we might run into if we act generous and therefore have less to ourselves? Can God take care of that? The answer, what if my little seed doesn't grow? Well, God is in charge of seeds and growing. And he promised that he would make sure that you have what you need so that you could have a harvest of righteousness. 2 Corinthians 9, Paul said, "And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work." If your heart is inspired by God's heart, and you say, I want to bring more generosity into this world, and I know I'm going to need to take some of my seed and put it out there so I have less seed, God says here, he's able to bless that so that you have what you need to not only be generous, but to do good work in this world. If you're on board with doing the work that God says is valuable, he will help you accomplish that work. So the real sticking point then for us is, do you believe this? Do you believe that if you are committed to bringing more gratefulness into the world through acts of generosity, do you believe God will help you with that and make sure that you can accomplish this? Do you believe this quote, God is able to bless you so that at all times you will have all that you need to do every good work? If you believe this, if you really believe that God will work with you as you set out to generate gratefulness, if I believe this, then what does it mean for my view on charitable giving? Then it means each of you should give what you've decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. If God's got your back when you set out to be generous, which creates gratefulness in the people around you, then it means we're not fighting fear reluctantly. It means we're not under compulsion, like, you better do this or else, says God. You better do this or else, says your church. You better do this or else, says your conscience. Instead, it's like, I'm not reluctant. I'm not under compulsion. I can kind of do what I want, and I don't have to be worried. In fact, it's kind of fun. God loves a cheerful giver. So if I believe this, then the fear of generosity fades. If I believe that God provides for those who act generously, then the fear of generosity fades, because the end goal of it is not going to be ruin, it's going to be blessing. Paul continues, your generosity will result in thanksgiving to God. You will generate gratefulness, is where we're getting at. If you can overcome the fear of generosity, your generosity will generate gratefulness. God will be praised. So being generous generates gratefulness in the lives of other people, which means you have power. Right? Sometimes you may feel powerless, like you don't have the money to do what you want, you don't have the time to do what you want, don't have enough influence to change the world, and there's so much bad on the news or in health or in your finances, and we just feel carried along by bad news. But if you believe what we're talking about today, then it means you have incredible power to change reality in this world, what other people experience, and how their very existence works. Being generous generates a 40% increase in your happiness. There's 3 studies that I read, and I've heard this all over the place in several books, and if you want to know the sources, come find me, but generally you're 40% more likely to say, I am happy, if you are involved in acts of generosity or charitable giving. Another thing that being generous generates is gratefulness in others. Their experience of this world isn't all trouble and getting scammed and bill collectors, but when they run into you, if you're generous, they run into good, and they have a sense of gratefulness, and they realize there is some good in this world. It's not just a machine driving me down and tearing me apart, but there's kindness in this world. And that, of course, is connected to our last Bible quote, which said it would result in thanksgiving to God. That when people's view of you change, and they, through you, meet the concept of grace and kindness and generosity, that changes how they view the world and can lead to a change in how they view the concept of there being a good God in charge of the world. So if you're interested then in using your power to not only increase your own happiness, but also give greater honor to God and make a positive impact in the lives of other people, let's get planting. So you take your seed of generosity and you're ready to stick it in the ground somewhere to do the work, by doing the work of charitable giving. So we're going to ask, what's the planting technique that the scriptures recommend? God's view of charitable giving. I'm going to use an illustration from when I was a kid. We were kind of poor, big family out in the country, not a big salary, and ate a lot of produce out of the garden. So when we would help Mom plant the garden, she would give us this little stick. You'd put the stick between each seed, and then you'd place the next seed, and you had to make sure they were so deep with so much space in between them. There was a wise way to plant the bean seeds in the garden. In the scriptures, God gives us a planting technique that he says is wise and will lead to good things. This is helpful because remember that when God encourages generosity, his end goal is not your ruin. You don't have to feel like, if I'm going to be a generous person, it also means I have to swear off any wealth accumulation. I have to give myself into abject poverty. I have to ruin myself by giving all my money away until I'm a beggar. Or I have to ask God, how much of my money are you going to take before I can be viewed as a good Christian? If you're interested in planting generosity, which generates gratefulness in other people, here's some key approaches to Christian generosity. First of all, simply give it forethought. Plan it ahead of time. You can read elsewhere in Paul's writings about, he said, on the first day of the week, not the last day of the week, set aside an amount that you're going to dedicate to the things of God and good. So it's planned ahead of time. The second idea is that whoever's been given much will be asked much, and whoever's been given very little will be asked little. That sets up proportionate giving, or giving by ratio or percentage. So if you choose a percentage of your incoming blessings and say, I'm going to give a percentage, an unchanging percentage of that to help other people in generous acts or charitable giving, then if you use that same percentage, it's irrelevant how much you make or how much you have, because if you have tons and tons of income and you give a 10% gift of that to church and charity, well, then you're giving a large volume amount, quantity amount. And if you have a really small, modest income, or like finances are really tight and you feel like God has blessed you that much, then a 10% or a percentage of that you give to others is a really small amount or quantity, but it's the same percentage. So 10% of a lot is a good chunk, and 10% of a little is a good little chunk, but it's still the same 10%. So giving percentage or proportionate giving takes away the fear. So if you have a bad month of income, then you give a small amount of generosity. And if you have an incredible amount of income, then you give a larger amount, but it's always the same percentage. Many Christians in history use the Old Testament example of a 10% tithe. We already heard that you get to decide what it is yourself, so you're not bound by anything, but a wise approach for many people is live on 80%, save 10%, and give 10%. The third one is first fruits, not leftovers. That we don't treat our priorities to be generous the way we treat leftovers in the refrigerator. Think about your refrigerator. Is it possible there's something on the bottom shelf way in the back corner in a Tupperware dish that, like, you're not sure what it is? It might be a vegetable because it's fuzzy and green like broccoli, or else maybe it was an old piece of meat and now it's fuzzy and green because of mold. Whatever it is, you don't really need it anymore, so find somebody to give it to. We try to avoid looking at our lives and saying, where's the junk? I don't really want it. Well, let's give it to Jesus or offload it somewhere. It's not the leftovers, but the first fruits we take from the top when we do acts of charitable giving. And then maybe one of my favorites probably is down here. I don't know if you can see this, but it's a little light bulb with a smiley face. And he's got a smiley face because he's happy that he's in charge of his own choices. And that's the big idea, that Christian generosity or charitable giving is my own joyful decision. Like, I taught you principles here that you want to keep in mind, but as a Christian, I as a pastor, your church, nobody really gets to dictate what your generosity looks like. You just do it whatever sounds fun to you and whatever reflects love for God and others, and it is a joy. So think about giving like a happy light bulb, but find an idea that's fulfilling and meaningful, and just enjoy the feel of being generous. Okay, I'm going to review these one more time. We got the watch up there. That means ahead of time, plan your generosity. The next one, the percentage sign in the little box, give proportionately. As God blesses you, that determines how you bless other people. The next one with the banana peel and the fish bones. We do not give the old banana peel and the fish bones to our generous causes, but we give first fruits, not leftovers. And last, that little happy light bulb. Come up with your light bulb idea of what you want to do, how you want to be generous, and just enjoy the freedom of you figuring out what you want your levels and your objects of generosity to be. Well, thanks for sticking with us. This was a 30-minute history of some New Testament churches as they wrestled with generosity and how to put it into practice, and encouragement to you. We're back to this funny ink blot, and I hope now that you see this, it's not just a map, but if it would be an ink blot, you would say, I'm looking at these lands where there were these early Christian churches, and you know what I see? I see generosity. That's the same kind of generosity that I like to find a way to bring into my life and through me into the lives of other people. Enjoy this. You've got power and meaningful purpose and opportunity to bring light into a dark world by generating gratefulness. All right, that wraps it up. Thanks for hanging on with me and following this logic. I hope that you find the joy of giving. May the Lord bless you in that special gift. Till next week.